Once again, to everyone in the room, the Vice Chancellor in absentia and the entire teaching staff of Makerere University, the principal and other teaching staff of the School of Law, the academic staff present, participants from the National Defense College, who I've been reminded to mention is mandated to train on national security, senior officers of the UPDF Corps present, our fellow students in the room, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, our online participants who have following on YouTube, you are most welcome. You're welcome to the public lecture and discussion on the 50 years after the Asian expulsion. The theme for the day is what have we learned over half a century. Starting off, we will have remarks from the Makerere School of Law principal, Professor Chris Mbazira. We will then have remarks from one of the co-directors of the Refugee Law Project, Ms. Devota Nue. We will then have remarks from one of the co-founders and directors, Amani Institute, Honorable Lyandro Komakech, all of who are here. Following that, I will be inviting the moderator for the next session, Dr. David Simba, who will be taking on and moderating the lecture, as well as the 15-minute session we will have for each of the commentators. We will then have audience interventions. For those of us who are following online, please feel free to comment in the chat. We are tracking those comments at that point. We will then have remarks from our main person giving us the lecture. And then we will have the unveiling and interactions with the sculptures that you have seen right at the stage, at the front of the stage, but of which are also hanging up here. Without further ado, I would like to invite the Principal School of Law, Professor Chris Mbazira, to come and welcome us into this amazing space we are seeing here. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, Madam MC. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Is it already afternoon? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All protocols observed. As introduced, I'm Professor Christopher Mbazira, the principal of the School of Law here at Makerere. The Refugee Law Project, as we shall hear later, is part of the School of Law here at Makerere, working on a number of things. We shall get to hear from the colleagues that are working there directly. Thank you so much, colleagues at the Refugee Law Project, for organizing this. It makes us proud as a School of Law that we are able to host gatherings of this nature and discussing subjects such as we are discussing today. When I was asked by colleagues at the Refugee Law Project to give these opening remarks, and I asked about the subject, it brought memories because I was impacted in one way or another by the expulsion of Asians, and I thought I should quickly share my experiences. My father was a pseudo businessman in Jinja. He ran a small duka in a place very close to Gaddafi army barracks, and he used to get merchandise from Asian traders in Jinja town. At the expulsion of Asians, he was identified as one of the business people that could step into the shoes of the Asian business people that were to leave the country. He had very minimal education. I think if we look at his education in the current context, he didn't go beyond primary 4. He told me a story that overnight he became a bourgeois because he took over 2 shops with merchandise in it and a number of things. And it's only by running that business that he was able to raise us up, 10 of us. He was able to pay our tuition. But later, the business collapsed. And right now, when I think about the way he was doing his business, what I could see is that one of the reasons the business collapsed is that he was not running it in a professional manner. I remember vividly his businesses are starting to go down in the 2 shops when Uganda Revenue Authority came to the scene, anti-smuggling unit at the time, And it somehow, I don't know whether I should use the word interfered, but it somehow impacted on the trade that was happening across the border. So looking at this subject, that's how it impacted on me. I don't know whether I should say I have my biases, but nevertheless, I feel that it's an important subject that we are discussing today. Later, of course, when I got to where I am now as a human rights lawyer, I now again see the subject from a different dimension, because I look at the human rights issues that arose from the expulsion, including issues around property rights, including around issues of citizenship and identity. I know I'm not competent to comment on the class relations, again from a human rights perspective. Class relations, especially in the context of economics, but we know that there have been tensions in some respects between the Asian community and the Ugandan community as far as access to economic resources is concerned. With that, I welcome you to this lecture today. It's coming at a time when Makerere is celebrating 100 years, and this lecture is positioned as one of the activities of the School of Law, the Refugee Law Project and partners as we celebrate 100 years. It fits there then in the sense that the expulsion of Asians, of course, impacted on Makerere in a number of ways. Quite a good number of staff of Makerere were Asians. Some had Ugandan nationality, some didn't. The same applies to students. So this lecture gives us an opportunity as we celebrate 100 years, also reflect on the impact that that expulsion had at the time, but also in some context, the continuing impact. So thank you so much, and I specifically thank the colleagues, including Professor Mamdani, that is going to give us the key lecture, as well as colleagues that are going to comment on the lecture, including my colleagues from the School of Law, Professor Sylvia Tamale. Thank you so much. You're welcome and enjoy the lecture.
Professor Mahmood Mamdani is Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. Until February 2022, he was the Executive Director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research, where he spearheaded the establishment of the first ever interdisciplinary doctoral program in social studies, an experiment which 10 years ago has turned MISA into a very acclaimed knowledge-producing center in Africa, south of Sahara, and north of Limpopo. I thought that deserves a hand clap. Needless to remind you that I am an alumnus of the MISA experiment. He earned his PhD from the Harvard University in 1974, just under 2 years after the expulsion of Uganda Asians, whose 50th anniversary we are reflecting upon today. Professor Mamdani's first academic book to hit the university shelves, stemming from his doctoral thesis, came out in 1976. It was titled Politics and Class Formation in Uganda. But little known, and yet perhaps most consequential for the discussion today, is Mamdani's book titled From Citizen to Refugee. The book came in 1973, produced from his forced migration experiment in Britain. Professor Mamdani's latest publication is titled Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. It was published by his alma mater, Harvard University Press, in the thick of the COVID lockdown. Today, we are going to have a 50 years anniversary reflection, and Professor Mamdani has volunteered to take us back on a half a century journey, a diet which was very much present when it was being cooked, served, and today reserved for us. Let's welcome Professor Mamdani for his lecture today.
I'm not very good at formalities. Maybe that's why I never went into diplomatic service. So I'm just going to say a general but heartfelt thank you to all the organizers. I will only mention one name of Barney Afako, who actually volunteered me. I didn't volunteer myself. Barney, thank you. I left Uganda in November 1972, during the last week of the expulsion, for a refugee camp in London. 6 months later, I took my first academic job at the University of Dar es Salaam. After the fall of Amin, I came to Kampala as a frontier intern in mission with the All Africa Conference of Churches, with an office at the Church of Uganda headquarters in Mengo. The next year, 1980, I joined Makerere University. I made it a point to ask most people I met about their thoughts on the expulsion. Almost all responded, it was bad how Amin did it. Nobody said the expulsion was bad. I realized that most Ugandans did not oppose the expulsion. This was the beginning of wisdom for me. 10 years later, I began asking the same question to friends, neighbors, and schoolmates from pre-72 Uganda days. All Uganda Asians, wherever I met them, in Kampala or in Britain. It was time for a second surprise. Over 90% said they would not want to return to the pre-72 days in Uganda. They too were not opposed to the expulsion. So my first observation, how come over 90% of residents of the country, black or brown, would not want to return to the days and years before the 1972 expulsion? The expulsion cannot just be understood as an event, as a single standalone event, an event which occurred in 1972. The event needs to be understood as the culmination of a process. Long before 1972, many Ugandan Asians had been disenfranchised by law. And the law I'm talking about is both Ugandan and British. The citizenship clause in the Independence Constitution of 1962 restricted citizenship by birth to those who were born of Ugandan parents and one of whose grandparents was also born in Uganda. My guess is that no more than 10% of people of Asian descent with a permanent residence in Uganda would have qualified for citizenship by birthright under this clause. Citizenship by registration or any other type of citizenship is not a right. It's a privilege conferred on you by the state. It can be withdrawn just as easily by the state. The 1995 Constitution changed the requirement for citizenship, substituted individual requirements for citizenship with citizenship by birth to a group requirement. Now, not the individual, but the group had to be indigenous to the country. Schedule 3 of the 1995 Constitution had a list of indigenous tribes. By this criterion, no Uganda Asian could be a citizen by birth after 1995. Under British law, Asian residents of Uganda lost the right of entry or the right of return, depending on how you look at it, to the UK after 1968, even if they were holders of British passports. The British distinguished between different kinds of citizens, and I will come to that later. My second observation, we need to distinguish between two different groups of Asians. Those pre-72 and those post-85. For the pre-72 group, Uganda was home. For most of the second group, the post-85 group, Uganda is a temporary abode. My talk will focus on the first group. Now to my topic. What have we learned over half a century? Learning is both formal and informal. Learning is also individual and group learning, collective learning. I'm going to begin with formal learning. This is a university dedicated first and foremost to formal learning. We read books, and sometimes we write. So I'm going to begin by talking about 4 books on this subject, which are an important part of what we have learned over the last 50 years. The first is a book by Ian Sanjay Patel. Is this for COVID or for me? I note she brought it only to me. Nobody else has been given this privileged treatment. Okay, thank you very much. So the first book is by Ian Sanjay Patel, The Study of British Immigration Policy. It's titled, We Are Here Because You Were There, Immigration and the End of Empire, published last year. Sanjay Patel's book begins with the 1968 Act, British Parliamentary Act, which differentiated between 2 groups of British citizens, white and non-white, historical and non-historical, distinguishing kith and kin from strangers. During the Asian expulsion, the British cabinet and bureaucracy came up with a new language to make this same racialized distinction. When writing of Uganda and discussing Uganda and British citizens in Uganda, they distinguished between what they call belongers, those who belong. Belongers were white. And non-white UKPH, meaning United Kingdom passport holders, which were eventually classified as refugees. The effect of these two sets of legislation, one in Uganda, the other in Britain, was like that of a pincer movement which disenfranchised many Uganda Asians before any were expelled. The numbers disenfranchised ran into thousands. My second book has to do with the claim that Uganda Asians were victims. There has developed, since 1972, a global industry portraying Uganda Asians as victims. Few in my generation, the first generation of those expelled, wrote of our experience. As a people, we were not chroniclers. We were also not given to reflecting on our own experiences critically. It is the children of refugees, second generation, who have attempted to address this deficit. These hand-me-down stories have gradually homogenized into victim narratives. But Uganda Asians are a poor fit as victims. For a start, the expulsion meant different things for different groups among Uganda Asians. For a substantial group, the lowest estimates are upwards of 12,000. So for upwards of 12,000 people, the expulsion liberated them from an impossible situation. According to intelligence reports, Uganda intelligence reports, something like 12,000 Asian residents of Uganda were stateless by 1971. They were without a right to work in the country. They had no trading license. Eventually no homes. At first they lived in places of worship, temples, mosques, gurudwaras. With an increase of numbers, they overflowed into one-room tenements. In the word of Bob Astles, an intelligence officer under Obote, and under Amin, these tenements resemble, quote, concentration camp-like conditions. By 1970, they were demonstrating almost every other day in front of the British High Commission. The first secretary of the British High Commission, Lee, a young man, probably his first job, empathized with them. He concocted a scheme with 3 Asians to have himself kidnapped onto an island in Entebbe so as to create a global scandal and to put the Uganda Asian story on the front pages of newspapers. Well, it didn't work. The British government and the Obote government got together, had a court case and sent him to London, disgraced him, accused him of having had a sex holiday on this island with women on the island. This group, 12,000, celebrated the expulsion. For them, Amin had opened the gates of Britain. Finally, they could look forward to another life. When I went to London, I met a friend of mine. He lived in a council house, council flat, a flat given by a local council to indigent families. He took me to the flat, showed me the rooms, including the prayer room. In the prayer room were photographs, gods and goddesses. But among them was the photograph of Idi Amin. He said, "What's this?" He turned to his mother. And the mother said to me, "Where would we be without him? He is the one who got us out of a terrible situation in Uganda. We have a council flat, we have free education, we have free medicine, subsidized transport, our children go to school, we have a future. He's like a god for us." In the next years, I realized that my friend's family was not the only one. There were many other families in that same position. Those who celebrated the expulsion. One book stands out in the chorus that I call the expulsion industry for its rare honesty. This is a novel called Kalolo Hill. Kalolo Hill is a novel by Nima Shah, lives in London. It's the portrayal of an Indian family. It's written through the eyes of a young bride, Asha, who has just married into the family. The bride comes from Jinja. Family lives on Kalolo Hill. The family is a rich merchant family. The book narrates Asha's journey, which is one of discovery. Day by day, she discovers the lies and deceptions that had become so much a part of life for Indian business families. So much a part of life that they seem normal and no longer abhorrent. As her world unravels, it peels like an onion, layer by layer, bringing the daily business of the Asian merchant community to light and raising a big question mark about the now standard and uniform story of Asian victims of theft, rape, violence, commonplace in the genre of expulsion stories. It is worth noting that there was no large-scale loss of life during the expulsion. I was in Kampala all 3 months. There were a few exceptions, but no large-scale loss of life. In a land known for sporadic massacres, there were no massacres of Asians. When massacres happened, they were of indigenous people. Also, there was hardly any large-scale theft. This should not be surprising, given that the expulsion itself was one big generalized theft. It left little room for individual thefts. Amin's soldiers were on the alert. Their orders were to make sure that no ordinary soldier tamper with property that was to be passed on to one officer or another. The thefts that took place were few and far between. But one common loss united those expelled in 1972. This was the loss of home. A sense of belonging develops over generations. The generation that was expelled lived as strangers afterwards. Musafir in Hindustani. Wherever they landed, they lived as if always ready to pack their bags and leave at short notice. Many of their houses had more the feel of guest houses rather than homes. My next book is about Amin, the master perpetrator. The flip side of Asian victim narratives has been another industry, equally a chorus, united by a single aim, to demonize Amin as an uncivilized brute. Mark Leopold's 2020 book, called Idi Amin, shines a critical light on this barrage of writings and media depictions of Amin that followed 3 expulsions. First of the Israelis, then of the Asians, and then of the British. This book is not on Amin, nor on his self-appointed, self-proclaimed victims, but on how the discourse on Amin changed direction from praising Amin as a noble savage who delivered the country and the continent from the erratic dictatorship of Obote, from that to demonizing the same Amin as an African Pol Pot, in the words of a British minister who had earlier ordered Amin's assassination. Leopold's point is that these books would be better read as a source of knowledge on those who wrote them than on Amin, who they purported to write about. The leading writer, we all know, was Henry Chamber. Okay? He began this genre of writing. The final book I want to talk about is my colleague's book, Professor Lunyiigo's redefinition of Uganda as an Indian colony. This book has just come out recently. It merits inclusion in this slim reading list. Professor Lunyiigo is a Makerere historian who had previously written 2 great books, one on Kabaka Mwanga, the Kabaka who fought the British at the turn of the 20th century, and the other on the land question, about the Bakopi and the Milo landlords. He's also a good friend. Let's begin with the title, Uganda, an Indian colony. The title is a stunner. It provokes, almost compelling the passerby to buy it. The title is a publisher's dream. Most of us are used to thinking of Uganda as a British colony. But an Indian colony? I ask myself, is this a commercial ploy? But then almost habitually I turn to the backside of the jacket. The backside of the jacket reads, quote, "The long and short of this book is that it puts the spotlight on Indians in East Africa, narrating them as deputy imperialists, sub-imperialists, privileged workers of the colonialists." So between the cover and the backside of the jacket, we have descriptions of 2 different books. The cover says Uganda was an Indian colony. The back of the jacket says Uganda was a British colony in which Indians were privileged assistants, sub-imperialists. It'd be good to have Professor Lunyiigo tell us which is the real title, so that we can hope for a second edition with just one title. The cover is about Uganda Indians. The back of the jacket says it's about Indians in East Africa. So were Indians sub-imperialists? This is hardly an original story. There has been a whole tradition of Ugandan scholars writing on the subject of sub-imperialism from the 1960s. And their theme has been that the Baganda were sub-imperialists. In the conquest of Bunyoro, in the conquest of eastern Uganda, led by Kakunguru, and in the conquest of the rest of the country. As the literature on sub-imperialism developed, the claim of sub-imperial powers who colluded with the colonial project changed into a recognition that what had changed was really the nature of colonialism. Direct rule had changed to indirect rule. And indirect rule could only be exercised through intermediaries. Good historians have the skill to dig into archives and come up with little known or even previously hidden facts. Professor Lunyiigo is an acknowledged historian. There are few facts in this book that I would dispute. I would dispute the idea that most Indians had companies registered overseas. 2 Indians. Give me a third example. I would dispute the idea that all the Indians who made good in London made good because they went with money from here. Requires facts. I don't know of any. And I have read lots of biographies of those who made good. Often the fact is drawn from the thesis, the conclusion. The conclusion precedes the fact. The riddle of Lwanga, Professor Lunyiigo's book, is that he announces the framework in the title, dilutes it in the back of the jacket, and then abandons it in the bulk of the book. For Uganda Asians, however, it's important to read Professor Lunyiigo's book, for it provides an important source of self-critique. When I read Professor Lunyiigo's account of the conference Amin had held with Uganda Asian leaders in the months before the expulsion, I was outraged at the historical failure of these so-called leaders. Amin opened the first conference with a list of Indian shortcomings: social exclusion, a business culture rife with deception and lies, a self-justifying racism that justified petty privileges colonialism conferred on them, while at the same time blaming the British for the colonial legacy, and a weak commitment to either the larger society or the country at large. He then went on to invite the same leaders to reflect as a community on the way forward, which these leaders, so-called leaders, refused to do. Because they said, we are a small group who can only leave it to the government to define the way forward. At a critical juncture in the history of both the country and the Asian minority, this was akin to abdicating responsibility. But this response illuminates their larger character. The Asian leaders were an economic elite, not a political elite. They never aspired to power, unlike other minorities in the region, say white settlers, the Nubi, or the Tutsi. Their political instinct was never to usurp power, but always to nestle close to those in power, to look up to them for a roadmap to a future. They aim to control the market, not the state. Minorities who aspire to rule, like the Tutsi or the Nubi or white settlers, were at times the target of genocidal prospects, but not the Asians. They would be expelled, not killed. Asians in Uganda, as in East or Southern Africa, were immigrants. They were not settlers. The difference is telling. Immigrants are prepared to be part of the political community to which they move. Settlers aim to create their own state, their own political community, a colony, more precisely, settler colony. Settlers are always at odds with native communities among whom they live. It is difficult to find a settler without a gun. It is just as difficult to think of a dukawala with a gun. As an individual, the Indian dukawala is proverbially known for accommodation, even timidity. This is hardly the human material from which to make conquerors or colonists. It is, though, the material from which to craft merchants. When an elite emerged from communities of dukawalas, they were an economic elite, not a political elite. When Indians used guns during the 1958 trade boycott, these were plantation owners, not the dukawalas. They were both Indian, but they belonged to different classes. The political elite are more likely to strategize the future. The economic elite are more likely to accommodate to it. Even when champions of industry or trade, like the Guptas in contemporary South Africa, or the Madhvanis under Obote I, aim at state capture, they do so in collaboration with existing political leaders. They do not become political leaders. There are, of course, exceptions, such as Rajat Nyogi, the editor of Transition in Uganda at the dawn of independence, or Pio Pinto Gama and Makhan Singh and others in Kenya, but they were not Asian political leaders, neither in their calling, nor their imagination, nor the following they mobilized. They looked Asian, but they didn't act Asian. Maybe this is why they do not find a place in Professor Lunyiigo's narrative, for they did not fit his argument. I'm coming to a close. As we think of the Asian legacy 50 years later, I leave you with 5 observations. 1, there is no one Asian legacy. There are several legacies, and they are contradictory. Not all are legacies we would like to wipe out from our collective memories. Some we would like to build on, others we would like to reform. Number 2, the Asian question can allow us to think the larger Ugandan question. Think of any of the big questions in this country. The Buganda question, the Northern question, the Karamoja question, and the Asian question. There is one thing common among these 4. The state has always claimed the right to solve each of these, first to define each of these, then to solve each of these on behalf of society, and always through violence. And it has never been successful. The result has always been perverse. State strategy has always been to set up one group or another, the Baganda at one point, the Asians at another, the Northerners after 1986, and the Karamojong all through our post-independence history, to set one or the other up as the enemy of society. Number 3, the great strength of African societies in the pre-colonial period was the ability to absorb newcomers, immigrants. The Baganda, for example, are said to have begun as 4 clans in the 13th century. Over centuries, they absorbed both immigrants and indigenous or originals. Both immigrants and those they conquered. But there was no distinction made between indigenous originals on one side and those non-indigenous on the other side. The African tradition is to integrate, not to segregate. Look around the continent. The capacity to integrate has been common to the Amhara, the Arabs, the Hausa, the Waswahili, the Zulu. I can go on with examples. The newly independent East African countries followed the colonial tradition and not the tradition of pre-colonial times. The clause on citizenship in the Independence Constitution of Uganda distinguished indigenous from non-indigenous residents, not those born in Uganda from those not between residents and non-residents. Indigeneity was defined by having at least one grandparent born in Uganda. This ruled out, as I have said, over 90% of Asian residents of Uganda, from a birthright to citizenship. The 1995 Constitution further entrenched this prejudice by acknowledging indigenous groups as tribes in law. After 1995, this government has restricted local government by restructured local government by multiplying district boundaries on the principle that each minority be recognized as indigenous and granted its own district. The alternative would be to acknowledge the equality of all residents in a territory. Number 4, the Asian question has not gone away, it remains. But it is no longer the original Asian question. The new Asian question emerged in the Museveni period. It has 2 features. One, the new Asians are not considered Ugandans, even if some of them may hold Uganda passports. For President Museveni, they are investors, not citizens. As investors, they are bearers of property, not of rights. They have neither political rights nor political obligations. They may be here year after year, but they live as permanent strangers without obligation to community or country. In the African imagination, they have become the prototype of a mercenary community. For the Asians, they live on sufferance, always on guard, never at peace. We may ask ourselves, in whose interest is this state of affairs? Certainly not in the interest of those identified as Asians, nor of the people of this country. The question merits further reflection. Finally, number 5. In the transition between 2 constitutions, 1972 and 1995, Ugandans have changed our notion of belonging. The 1995 Constitution defined entire groups and not individuals as indigenous. Between constitutions, new groups try to petition Parliament to be included in the list of indigenous groups. Several years ago, many such groups sent in petitions, including the Banyarwanda, the Somali, and the Baindi. President Museveni's response was to remind the Baindi that the world is divided into continents. God made each continent for a different race. Europe is for whites, Asia for browns and yellows, and Africa for blacks. Like the notion of indigenous, this story lacks a sense of history, or its sense of history is based on biology. It has forgotten a basic fact of history, that the human race began in Africa. It has also lost a sense of how the world is changing, including decolonization. Today, American law recognizes African Americans as Americans of African descent. One of the two contenders for the post of Prime Minister in the UK was born in India. The Indian and Pakistani states acknowledge the existence of South Asians of African origin, known as Siddhis. There is a Siddhi member of parliament in Pakistan. Some time ago, Ugandans of South Asian origin formed an organization called Asian African Association of Uganda. I want to cite from the preamble the statement of purpose of this organization before I sit down. Quote, whether citizen or not, whether in the country for generations or fresh off the plane, all persons of South Asian descent in Uganda are identified as Baindi. For someone who thinks of Uganda and Africa as home, to be called a Muindi is to live in the past, to ignore our present, and to be blind to the future. It is to live in this land as if one were a visitor. You cannot be a permanent visitor. That is a ticket to permanent insecurity and political isolation. We need to give a deep thought to who we really are and what is our relationship to Africa and African society. We are not South Asians. Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis. For South Asians live in South Asia and are committed to making a future there. Nor are we overseas South Asians who are part of a South Asian diaspora whose members aim to return home to South Asia after a temporary sojourn overseas. True, our origin is South Asia, but our present is African. Many of us hope to make a future in Africa. We are Africans of Asian origin, Asian Africans. I leave you with that sense of self-identity which points to a different politics and a different future. Thank you.
Whew. That was quite a diet. Thank you so very much, Mahmood, for this very critical reflection. 5 lessons. I'm not going to rehearse them. We have a neighbor panel of discussants to do the job. This conversation is being followed from near and far. People from Lebanon in Beirut, the UK, University of Warwick, Aligarh in India, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, at Old Kampala, Kiriandongo refugee settlement, in Nakasero, Gulu City, Adjumani town and all the refugee settlements, Makerere campus, and all the other Makerere offices are on our YouTube channels. It's a conversation of national intellectual importance. I also want to acknowledge the quotes from one online participant who just sums up the lecture as a great experience hearing exactly what happened before I was even born and of consequence to how I'll die. This is great. Let me snatch the next second to introduce you to our first panelist, the discussant of the lecture, Professor Sylvia Tamale. Professor Tamale is an acclaimed academic, the professor of jurisprudence, law, and gender at the faculty, at the school now of law. She is known for having been the first ever female dean of the then Faculty of Law. Her first seminal book, thank you for those supporting claps. Her first ever seminal book is titled When Hens Begin to Crow, Gender and Parliamentary Politics in Uganda. It came out in 1999. Her latest book titled Decolonization and Afrofeminism, which came in the thick of the COVID-19 lockdown 2020, is an important contribution, and I will dare call it a conceptual toolkit to help us think about how to decolonize our current historical predicament. We couldn't get any better first panelist to respond to this lecture than Sylvia. Thank you so much for honoring this.
Asante sana, thank you very much. All protocol observed. Thank you for making time to listen to us physically and online. Thank you, Professor Mamdani, for your provocative speech. Now, 50 years after Idi Amin expulsion of Asians from Uganda, we continue to be haunted by colonialism and coloniality. For me, the various elements of the Asian question bring into sharp focus the urgency to decolonize and deconstruct Eurocentric epistemologies of race, citizenship, nationhood, gender, and neoliberal economics. Professor Mamdani has discussed some of these issues and hinted on others. I will respond to some of them and highlight one specific area that I believe requires further attention and which Mahmood only gave slight attention. First, let me talk about the issue of decolonial race and citizenship. Imperialism and colonialism thrived on the paradigms of difference and violence. By focusing on skin color and exaggerating phenotypical differences, they created the illusion of race and constructed a racially based hierarchy. White people were placed at the apex, brown people in the middle, and blacks at the bottom of the race pile. In their appropriation of the Ugandan economy, the British imperialists adopted the strategy of divide and rule and positioned Indians as a buffer class between the Europeans and the Africans. Professor Mamdani has written extensively on this subject. And Ramkrishna Mukherjee, in his 1956 book, The Problem of Uganda, a study of acculturation, characterized Indians in Uganda as people living a parasitic existence on the toils of Africans and as pawns in the game of the British conquest. 2 decades, 20 years before the expulsion, Mukherjee accurately predicted that such conditions could only result in disastrous results for the Indian community, who would become scapegoats of the anger of indigenous Africans, given their overt role in aiding British exploitation of their land. Both Africans and Indians in Uganda have over the centuries internalized the racial stereotypes imposed on them through processes such as the education and legal systems, structural exclusions, microaggressions, and stigmatization. This state of affairs put a stop to the possibilities of differentiated humans to blend and cooperate. A common conception of our humanity would have worked against the imperialist agenda of a capitalist, profit-hungry empire. Until we squarely deal with the key issues of decolonization and decoloniality, the Indian question will remain with us at the 100th anniversary of Amin's expulsion. Asians and Africans must open their eyes to the superficial racial differences which imperialists augmented through pseudo-scientific ideologies. As members of both communities, we need to radically transform our ways of thinking, of knowing, and of doing in order to overcome neocolonialism and rehumanize ourselves. The racial sub-issues of citizenship and nationality that Professor Mamdani discusses are but elements of intersecting colonialities of being, of power, and of freedom. Jamaican scholar Sylvia Winter urges us to unsettle these tropes by reconceptualizing our very humanity. Indeed, the colonial race theorist Walter Mignolo explains that when the idea of citizenship first emerged in Western Europe, it was linked to the materialization and formation of the nation state, initiating a concept of communities based on birthplace and overriding communities based on faith. In colonial Uganda, it was important for Indians to claim imperial citizenship because as citizens of the empire, they could lay claims on both the colony and the metropole. Of course, the British used imperial citizenship to ensure that neither the Indians nor the Africans would attain equal status with them. After 1962, post-independence governments have continued to instrumentalize and redesign the abstract concept of citizenship to deny all types of minorities equal rights based on economic status, gender, ethnicity, race, religion, and so on. So, as Professor Mamdani lamented, tens of thousands of Indians whose socio-economic allegiance was to Uganda and sought Africanized citizenship were disenfranchised simply based on the birthplace of their grandparents. All of us here know very well that our citizenships are closely tied to our racial differences and used as powerful tools of othering and disenfranchisement. Those of us who have applied for visas know this very well. What is also important to note is the inequality in the treatment of different Indians. In other words, Indians in Uganda are not a homogeneous group. The second issue implicated, although only obliquely discussed in Mahmood's reflections, that is the role of select government institutions. I think it would be remiss not to discuss the role of two institutions in the post-expulsion reintegration of Indian capital into the Museveni neoliberal state and networks, and which are prominent but often overlooked today. Indeed, Mahmood makes no mention of them. In a bid to boost the neoliberal economy, the NRM regime adopted laws and policies to lure back departed and new Indians as investors, quote unquote, which clearly demonstrates that the country has not learnt from history regarding the Asian question. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it set up a revamped bureaucratic machinery to run or compensate expropriated Asian properties to their original owners through the Departed Asian Properties Custodian Board. The second institution established by the NRM government in 1991 was the Uganda Investment Authority that was largely designed to reincorporate our South Asian cousins back into the country. While under colonialism, they came to work on the railway, as soldiers, and to be dukawalas. The new crop of Indians were designated as investors. This would not have been a problem, except the NRM government did the same thing as the British. They privileged them at the expense of indigenous Ugandans. Such privileging is a major source of new racial tensions. Add to the diet the lack of transparency and accountability of these two government agencies, and you have another explosion waiting to happen. As one of the largest owners of real property in the country, the custodian board's operations are opaque at best. And if the 2009 special report of the Auditor General is anything to go by, the board is a cesspool of corruption, patronage, and mismanagement. It has basically thwarted all the gains which could have been made from the expulsion. On its part, not only has the Uganda Investment Authority given the Asian question a new twist of inequality, it has been particularly friendly to the new Asians on the block, that is, the Chinese. Again, under the impetus of the perceived benefits of foreign investment, a new foreign class of entrepreneurs is being privileged over the indigenous population. This new Asian question can only end in disaster. Now, my third point relates in part to a long-standing debate which underpins the whole issue of colonial impact, namely the chicken and egg relationship between the political and economic elite. Professor Mamdani has told us, and I quote, that the Asian leaders were an economic elite, not a political elite. They never aspired to power, unlike other minorities in the region, say white settlers, the Nubi, or the Tutsi. Their political instinct was never to usurp power, but always to nestle close to those in power, to look up to them for a roadmap to a future. They aimed to control the market, not the state, end quotes. I think there is a degree of dualistic separation in the way in which Professor Mamdani treats economics and politics here. This is an issue that preoccupied the debate at the MISA seminar on Wednesday, where Professor Mamdani discussed Professor Lunyiigo's book. In my view, there is a rather complex symbiotic or dialectic relationship between the two. Like Karl Marx said, the economic infrastructure, that is the base, influences the superstructure, that is the law, politics, and so on. At the same time, governance and the political ecology shape the economic base and ultimately drive social change. The close nestling with those in power tends to blur the boundaries between economic and political roles as the case of the South African Guptas demonstrated. While it is true that Idi Amin used political power to attempt to change economic relations, why did he fail so spectacularly in this bid? I believe that in the context of globalization and neo-colonial power relations, both the political will and the political capacity to change those economic forces and relations is limited. When the NRM came to power in 1986, it espoused a very nationalistic and socialist program that emphasized utilizing domestic resources and local capacities. Within the space of 2 years, they changed around, shifting from barter trade to fully embracing the neoliberal programs of the World Bank and the IMF. The question is, why and how did that happen? Why is it so difficult for the political actors in Africa to adjust the relations of production? I think Mahmood needs to revisit this issue. Finally, let me talk about the gender issue in the Indian question, which Professor Mamdani only alludes to when he briefly discusses Nima Shah's story in her novel Kololo Hill. Mahmood gives only a few hints and guesses about Nima's oppression at the hands of her merchant husband. But this links up to a much larger issue, namely the links between citizenship and gender in the reproduction of extreme inequalities among people. One of the pillars upon which Idi Amin stood in expelling Indians from Uganda was the issue of social exclusion. Indeed, no less a publication than the New York Times alleged that Amin expelled the Uganda Asians because he had been spurned by Giant Madvani's widow, Minaben. Amin argued that despite the decades that Indians had lived in Uganda, they had failed to integrate with indigenous Ugandans, particularly citing intermarriage as an example. Now, just last week, on August 9th, the Daily Monitor reported that the Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Indian Affairs had resurrected the issue when they asked the Indian community to, and I quote, allow Ugandan men to marry Indian women so as to deepen the relationship between the two countries, end quotes. Honorable Fred Opolot, the chairperson of the forum, is quoted as saying, and I quote, I know people-to-people integration has happened over generations, especially through business and investment. May I urge colleagues in the Indian fraternity to allow some of us or our children to get married to some of the beautiful Indian ladies, end quotes. The story went on to report that, and I quote again, asked whether this is acceptable to the Indians, Mr. Trusha Upadhyay, who coordinated the establishment of the forum, together with Rajesh Chaplot, the former chairman of the Indian Association of Uganda, said, in Kenya, the men are already marrying Indian women, but the marriages do not last due to the difference in culture, end quote. Now, apart from the paternalistic and commodifying tone used when talking about Indian women in this exchange, what is most striking is how the political economy of Indian women's bodies is invoked as a symbol of negotiating and building bilateral national interests by politicians and diplomats of the two countries. MP Opolot is offering a diabolical quid pro quo to the Indian community. Give us your women, and we'll give you Ugandan citizenship. 50 years after the expulsion, it is the bodies of women which are being foregrounded in a discussion about the benefits of integration. With such chauvinist, misogynist, and patriarchal views, of course, relations between the two races will continue to be fraught with tension. As African men want to lay claim to the bodies of Asian women, the Asian men fight back by invoking culture and tradition. Within this paradigm, Asian women are reduced to pawns in a game of competing masculinities. As with imperialism and the broader issues of coloniality, which the Asian question raised, at core is the quest for power, dominance, and subjugation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Tamale. That was quite succinct and yet sharp. I promise you that we have just started the critical engagement with the lecture. From biologizing history, which came out from the lecture, to ethnicizing citizenship and the new battleground of the political economy of female bodies of Indian. The second panelist is going to take us a notch higher. Professor Samwiri Lwanga Lunyiigo has been cited in the lecture, has been the raw material for eulogy and critique by the lecture. We are very much anticipating his response. Very quickly, Professor Lwanga Lunyiigo is a retired professor of history and archaeology at Makerere University. He read history and archaeology at the universities of Makerere and Ghana, Legon. He likes to identify himself as an unapologetic historian of the underbelly of society. A very proud native historian, some will say. But among many publications, his notable one is the 2007 book titled The Struggle for Land in Uganda, 1884-2005. It was followed 5 years later by another important contribution to rethinking our past, a book titled Mwanga II, Resistance to Imposition of British Colonial Rule in Uganda, 1884-1889. His latest, which came in May this year, is the one which has been very much referenced in Mahmood's lecture, Uganda, an Indian colony. I'm sure the ground is already set for Professor Lwanga Lunyiigo's response. The floor is yours, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining this conversation. I'm grateful to Ms. Nue, who invited me to say something about the Indian expulsion. Now, I thought that we had dealt exhaustively with my book that Mamdani had really finished with it. But since he's not yet done, I'll go back to it. But first, I want to mention that in 1969, 20,000 Kenyan workers were expelled by Obote from Uganda. And nobody talks about this expulsion. I don't know why, but it was a major expulsion of people from the East African community, and the Kampala Agreement guaranteeing the flow of factors of production. The Kampala Agreement had been signed in 1967. I don't know why the human rights people, the journalists, don't talk about this issue. It's only 50 years ago. We are not talking about something which happened 50 years ago. Very close to one another. Why is this? These Kenyans had property, which they left. They were not even given 90 days. I think 1 week. They left everything here. So why is nobody pleading on their behalf? Secondly, the expulsion of Asians, Indians, is not unique to Uganda. In Burma, now Myanmar, General Ne Win expelled them in 1961. And in Madagascar, Rasuraka expelled them in 62. And I don't know whether they are observing these anniversaries there, but why does this expulsion come to prominence? Now, I will first talk about my book, which Mahmood referred to. Now, I suggest very humbly that you read the book yourself. Let not Mahmood Mamdani read the book for you. And then you'll be able to make your own judgments. But to go back to Wednesday, to which have been pushed by Mahmood, I defined colonialism. And I defined colonialism as an economic enterprise. And it is from that vantage point that I call Uganda an Indian colony. In fact, I wanted to use another title, the Indian Raj, but I preferred this one. The economy, in my view, leads politics. That's why you hear of state capture. The Guptas in South Africa, for example. And that's why those of you who still have the energy will have to write a book on the second Raj, the Indian Raj in Uganda, because I see it on the horizon. So, from that point of view, I think our Indian cousins were the real colonizers of Uganda. Now, throughout my writing, I avoid the word citizenship. Lawyers like Professor Tamale will understand it, but I don't. But what I know, it is that it is subject to manipulation. So I use the word native. That one you cannot manipulate. And I want to draw your attention to what a British writer said. He says, and this gentleman is Andy Lester of the University of Leeds. He said that Indians kept their man, that's the heart. Man is heart. In India, they kept their dhani, that is wealth, in Britain, and kept their tani, that's their bodies, in Africa, or in Uganda for that matter. I don't know whether you agree with that. I don't know whether Mahmood agrees with that, but this was the observation of a British observer, academic. Now, before you can understand the expulsion, you must have the background of this expulsion. Why did it take place? And Professor Tamale is predicting another one. Because of the economic exploitation, the economic domination for so long. I don't think it is because African men wanted to marry Indian women that they were expelled. I don't think so. Sir Andrew Cohen, in the 50s, had observed that if we are to create one Uganda, then these economic inequalities had to be worked on. And in my view, he did a very good job. He's the one who revised the Cooperative Act of 1946, because when it was enacted, the registrar of cooperatives had a lot of power, and many Africans objected to this. So in 1953, the act was amended, and that's when most of the cooperative society registrations took place. Secondly, he established the African Loan Fund so that budding natives could get credit from some of these, from the fund. And it was during his governorship that the Uganda Commercial Bank came into being. It is unfortunate that the IMF World Bank regime did away with this bank, because without credit, you cannot get anywhere in business. And what we have today are foreign banks. Ours have died, have been killed. And you cannot expect Africans, natives, to go anywhere without sources of credit. And this was very smartly, the sources of credit, we have very smartly done away with. Mamdani also talks about the people, the Indians, who appreciated what Amin had done. He has talked about the prayer spaces in some of these homes, Indian homes in Britain, where the images of Amin are represented in the holy places. So he also mentions that during the expulsion, no Indian was killed. Which I think is a credit you can give to Amin, that people were not killed. But of course, after that, a lot of natives were killed by Amin. Those who were thought to compete for power were killed. But the peasants remained rather intact. They were not such a big target. Most Ugandans, he mentions 90%, liked what Amin did. They thought that after the departure of Indians, the economy is going to be in our hands. But the economic war was mismanaged. If it had not been mismanaged, maybe the economy would be in our hands now. But it was mismanaged. And I mean, given his background, you cannot blame him much. A lot of literature has come up on the expulsion of Indians. Recently, I read a manuscript for some publisher where a French author talked about Amin the Strangler. Now, when Amin was strangling for the British during Mau Mau, he was a good man, their son of a bitch. When Amin was getting rid of his enemies, political enemies, he was a monster. So when he was doing it for the British, he was okay. When he was doing it for himself, he was a monster. But I want to leave you with one question. Who created Amin? Whose creature was Amin? My sense is that it was a British creature and not a Ugandan creature. They created Amin, they promoted him, and eventually he took power. I think one of the mistakes both Obote and the British made was to underrate Amin's intelligence. Amin was not schooled, very rudimentary education. He did not have much English, and therefore he was dismissed. And in 1971, when the British were discussing who would replace Obote, Obote had become a nuisance and they wanted to get rid of him. He was opposing the sale of British weapons to South Africa, and they thought that it was time for him to go. But who was going to replace him? Whom were they going to choose to replace Amin? To replace Obote? They settled on two Ugandans, Basil Bataringaya and Idi Amin. But they eventually dismissed Basil Bataringaya because they thought they could manipulate Amin much more easily than Bataringaya. And so they thought they had their son of a bitch again. But this was not to be. From the 1950s and even earlier, Indians we are taking out money from Uganda. They avoided taxes, took money out of Uganda, and by the time they were expelled, they had around 342 million pounds in British banks. That's the milking that I think I talked about. And all of a sudden, they rose as big operators in the British economy. People were sympathetic that they went penniless. But all of a sudden, because of their business genius, many of them became millionaires. But is this money that had left Uganda over the years that they joined, and that's what made the Asian miracle in Britain. Now, the Madivani businesses, these are multinationals now. Meta multinationals. But the money came from here. They built, in the 50s, they built factories in Gujarat. They also built in Britain and Canada and America. If you follow what they have, it is stunning, but they made it on the backs of the poor peasantry in this country. And that's why many Ugandans were supportive of this action. I'm not saying that all Indians were in the exploiter category. There were many who were not. And that's where maybe Amin needed to look a bit more closely on this issue. For instance, there was the Ismaili community, which had emphasis with us, with the natives. And the Aga Khan community and the Aga Khan Karim, Prince Aga Khan, Prince Karim, had a very enlightened policy. And in 1962, most of the Indians who took out Ugandan citizenship were Ismailis. They had set 1964 as the date when those who wanted Ugandan citizenship should get it. But then most Indians did not want Ugandan citizenship. They preferred to have British passports. But they panicked in 1968 when the Immigration Act, the British Immigration Act was enacted. And they became sort of second-rate citizens. They couldn't easily get into Britain. But in that same year, and I think I will stop with this, just 2 minutes. The leaders of East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, agreed at the summit, they agreed, the summit was held in Nairobi. Following this summit, they agreed that the 3 East African community heads of states invited Britain and India to have a discussion. But Britain, the British representatives didn't come and the Indian representative did not come. They declined to attend. But President Jomo Kenyatta, President Julius Nyerere, and Obote agreed that Asian non-citizens should go. And between that time and when expelled Indians, 120,000 Indians had left Kenya and Tanzania. On the other hand, Milton Obote betrayed this summit, the summit decision. Instead, he cut a deal with the British, who had panicked, and they agreed that every year, 12,000 Britishans they agreed that every month, 12,000 Asians would leave for Britain. This would have taken quite a long time. And Amin cut it short. Not because that process had not started, but Amin cut it short. And if you know that you may be one of the 12,000 who is going next month, then you don't stock your shops. And the economy of Uganda, by the time Obote left, was collapsing. So if Obote had remained, it would have collapsed, but incrementally. Amin mismanaged the economic war. Some Asians were happy with this, that they got, it became easier for them to go to Britain, and the majority of natives were also happy. It doesn't matter really whether the Asians are here, the Indians are here or not. The condition of the peasant remains more or less this.
Even the microphone went. Sorry. Thank you so very much, Professor Lwanga Lunyiigo, for that sterling cryptic end. Why the expulsion happened here in Uganda the way it did. In 1971, we are told that Mobutu, in the then Zaire across the border, launched also his Retour à l'authenticité project. A few months down the road, Greek and Polish merchants in then Zaire were told to pack up and go. Very soon, the Zairean Munene, which became the equivalent of Amin's Mafuta Mingi, took over the economy, only for a short span. Are there some similarity between the land on this side of Semuliki and the other on the other side of the Semuliki Bank? Maybe we need another conference of expulsions, not just in East Africa, but also in Francophone, Central, Western Africa. That is for another time, but let's wind up our panel with our last substitute panelist, who will unfortunately not have the privilege of 15 minutes, but only for 10 minutes, to give us their critical comments. Honorable Lyandro Komakech is a non-social scientist and a political actor from the ranks of the Democratic Party in Uganda. He holds not just one, but 2 master's degrees. One in development studies from the Uganda Matters University, and another in international relations and diplomatic studies from Makerere. Until 2021, Honorable Komakech was the Honorable Member of Parliament for the Gulu municipality, the then municipality, under the DP ticket. He served on the committee, among others, on foreign affairs. Lyandro is currently co-directing the Amani Institute's Uganda, who is our co-host. Bwana Lyandro, the floor is yours.
I've been warned to speak for only 10 minutes. You are also aware that I'm a substitute of Betty Bigombe. I don't know, in my life, everything I do, I'm always substituting. I substituted Mao when he could not be nominated to come to Parliament in 2016. Then I was called to be the dangerous substitute. I came to Parliament. I came here as part of the organizers. And I made remarks and I was told, if you don't see it badly, you can also join the panel to substitute for Betty Bigombe. I did not say no. Possibly in future, I'll be requested to also offer to run the country for a few years. It looks like something that way. So I need to give in just a few of what I listened carefully from Professor, which are very remarkable statements based on realities of the experiences of a forced migrant. Professor mentioned many questions, which I hope as we leave here, we may begin to answer them. The Asian question, stated very clearly. And he made many observations on those questions. He also raised new other questions that are always not addressed. The Karamoja question, which is ongoing. And for those who know Karamoja, this is part of Uganda that was brought into this state called Uganda. It was the last with Bunyoro. And they were forcefully brought here. And you remember that if you were supposed to suffer, the British would take you to Karamoja. They said that you have been imprisoned to go and live in Karamoja. Those were the days. And Karamoja, as part of the question, is also this area where the British, when they were negotiating in the United Nations, offered to the Israeli Jews to come and be resettled in Karamoja. But the Jews said Karamoja was not the promised land. That is how they declined the invitation of the British. We would not know how we would be mixing the Asian question and the Jewish question and all these other questions. When you look at the expulsion of Asians in 1972, we need to draw also our attentions on before independence. What had taken place? The building of a railway made this country what it is. The British built Uganda Railway to exploit resources in the hinterland, but they brought the Indian labor, who were then called the coolies. I don't know what coolies meant, but I think they meant laborers. So as the building of Uganda Railway starts in 1896 in Mombasa, the Indian coolies were at the forefront of the construction of Uganda Railways, with many challenges along the way. Tsavo National Park, there were man-eaters, the lions, ate many coolies there. Until the railway arrived here, I think 1931, that marked the beginning of Kampala as the new urban center. Now, in all these processes, we see that the coolies worked so hard, but when they arrived here, of course, many other constructions went to Kasese, as the north went to Pakwach. Urban centers began to be created, and they began to occupy those urban centers as new entrepreneurs. One distinct thing in all this process is that the indigenous looked at the Indian laborers together with the British, because the British made what they call bombers. They would sleep in those places, rest camps. At the end, the indigenous population was completely detached from this new group of people. And that gap was not good. Because the integration process that should have actually begun a long time ago with the newcomers never took place properly. In Buganda, you know the Buganda as a very inclusive society. They even have concepts they use for integration. They use words like Muganda gere gere, Muganda wau, Muganda Njanech Komita. Now these are concepts of integration. There are many foreigners who are now proper indigenous in Buganda because of the way society integrated them. But I think in the context in which we have looked at these processes, we have seen that the Asian community remained together with the British. Because the British lived in senior quarters. If you go in all these towns, they are what we call senior quarters. Not a single indigenous African was supposed to step there. The Africans lived in junior quarters. The Indians lived in the center of town, the business center, where the Africans would wander this new structure of houses. In Gulu, it was very clear that if you are going to town, you are going to town to meet foreign people, to do business with them quickly and go away. So by 6 o'clock, Anacholi was mandated to be walking out of Gulu town, back to the village. Nobody lived in town. It was only the Indians and the British. It was a very big social gap, which did not allow integration. Now, at the end of the day, there was a lot of discussion around why are these people building houses that have very long tails? They used to call it long tail houses. If you walk today in all our towns in Uganda, I think the Indian or the Asian communities have left an architectural impact in terms of the structure of our urbanization. Those who have not lived in these houses, I don't know. I know many of you who are beneficiaries of the departed Asians. But I think this is something we need to bring to a stop. One thing that I pick from Professor's statement and observation is that while the 1972 was the climax of the expulsion, but there were a lot of simmerings, there were a lot of indicators of some of these challenges. Look at the 1940s. In the 1940s, the Baganda had already started an uprising against the Asian traders. What we call the Indian boycotts, for those who remember. There was a man who led that boycott, who later became known as Asasude. Asasude was a very stubborn rioter, protester, who would walk into the Indian shops, the Asian shops, and demand for items, but would not pay. So when you ask him in the police stations, he would call, his name was Asasude. He has paid. That was in the 1940s. So you can see that the perception of the Baganda at that time were not in tandem in terms of trade and inclusion with the Asian entrepreneurs. And this all goes back to what the British were doing, because the democratic infrastructure which should have been put in place by the British were not there. They were running this country as an enterprise. No wonder, even the name Uganda, Professor, is subject to a question. What is the meaning of Uganda? We call ourselves Ugandans. I'm a Ugandan. that gentleman, in the name of Sir Harry Johnston, when he concluded a very bogus deal with the Baganda regents in 1900, he fooled them. They signed an agreement in English, but then they gave them a wrong interpretation in Luganda version and Kiswahili version, which remained in the palace. And when with the English version, that was so distilled that the Baganda leaders did not know what it contained. Little did they know that the land was going. In Britain, the whole thing was presented as a very successful economic enterprise. And because of excitement, Buganda Agreement in English became Uganda Agreement. They changed it. They removed B to mean something else, U. So it became Uganda Agreement 1900. Now when the British Parliament was debating this through the Colonial Office, they passed this as a name of a project of this place called now Uganda. So sometimes we may need to also go back to the Ugandan question, that even the Ugandanness, that word, was not arrived at. It was a product of a deal which went wrong. Uganda. A product of historical accident that we continue to grapple with today. That professor gave very clear submission to this, and for us as actors who suffered, because professor I remember in his earlier submission in one of the programs sometime, talked about in any situations of conflict, there are those who suffer. There are also those who benefit. So you have beneficiaries, you have victims, you have even bystanders, those who just look at. And there are those who are entrepreneurs in the problem. Now for our case, I think the British has been the greatest entrepreneurs that reaped a lot. Even the railway that we talked about today, Uganda Railway the debt was paid back by the export of cotton and coffee and tea from Uganda. We paid it all. But today the railway has remained for Kenya. But this is Uganda Railway. There's need for those who are in Parliament today to revisit also our properties right from Mombasa up to Tororo. Uganda Railway, part of it must be reclaimed because it was paid for completely, even the land, everything else, by the cotton, coffee, and cotton that we exported to Britain. So, as intermediaries, I think the Asians did their best. But one of the things I would like to possibly ask Professor is, while the Asian question still exists, and we have, as you said, permanent strangers, but we also have new investors in the name of how things have changed now, it would then be, how do we avoid these repeated mistakes of the past and the present, where now we have changed the Asians who used to be called then, but now are called investors? And then how do we forge an inclusive, multiracial, rainbow kind of prosperous Uganda? Those two fundamental questions in the Asian question and in the Uganda question. Because this still exists and it gives us a lot of worry. When you look at the example that Serali Bandali Jaffa, the son of Bandali, who came with the coolies, he established his cotton plantation in Luero in the early times and integrated so well with the Baganda of Luero. And out of the cotton enterprise, he had money to construct a very modern building in the present-day Fairway Hotel. Now, Bandali's son, later, because of the way they integrated with the people of Buganda, became so close to Buganda Kingdom, to the extent that Jeffa Serale Bandali was elected through the Luchiko in 1962 to represent Kampala West in the Parliament of Uganda. 1962. He was given that. And for me, this gives an example of a practical way of how integration should have been. You can now see that the building that his father built later, Jaffa, offered this building to the Pope in 1969. When the Pope came to Uganda in 1969, Jaffa was now a member of parliament. He explained to Obote that because of accommodation that is inadequate in Kampala, he would rather offer his father's building to accommodate some of the papal delegation that were to come. At the end of the day, they turned their home into a guest house that received the Pope's delegation. When the Pope was leaving, he handed over to the family an award of a medal, a papal medal. He's a Muslim, they were Muslims, and a rosary. At the end of the day, when the Pope left, that guest house became Fairway. And it is still serving Ugandans. The grandchildren are now the ones that are managing Fairway Hotel. Now, this kind of model, when you look at in many ways that the Asians related, I think it's one of those classical cases that needs to be explored in terms of how we respond to some of these questions. Of course, I will not make any comment to Professor Tamale. That was a very strong one in terms of the patriarchy approaches to integration where men are claiming spaces. I think this should be a normal process. Unless the men are trying to say that you must have a structural process to access women from other places. But I think it should be normal, in normal relations, that these are things that are not taught in school. These are human relations, that you should have the skills on how to go about it. So I will not make any more comment on that. But as I am being warned very seriously by the physical presence of the moderator, I would end by this. I would say, Professor, you submitted very, very deeply, and you had actually your real memories about all this that took place. For me, the issue is now on the state then and the state now. The nature of the state has been changing. While in the early times, the British, through their ways, pretended to call us through indirect rule. The National Army that you see today was a creation of a very dangerous institution, by then the King African Rifles, which was brought on board by mercenaries in the names of Emin Pasha and his group. But today they are different. But then they came because the philosophy of protection of foreigners in the indigenous land was that you must have a foreign mercenary that can control the indigenous. And that was how the army was created. At the end of the day, their work was to protect the foreign interests against the indigenous population. But we are happy that through these processes of formations and reformation, things have changed. But for me, the most important thing is how do we then respond to some of repeated violence that have taken place? If you look at in the history of this country, when I was still in RLP, we did that 2-year study where we found out that there has been more conflicts created in Uganda than political parties formed. Rebel groups have been more than political parties formed. And they would go to government and the rest. But now, the issue is the methodology right? Is it the right technology to say that we should do institutional reforms, we should do accountabilities, we should do all these processes, memories, and the rest? Will that be enough response to create a state that is friendly? Is that the best way to have an architecture of nation building that will last with sustainable peace? This is the question that possibly you could also reflect on, because the state has been at the center of violence in those days. But then when they do it, the accountabilities must be to the individual. The criminal justice model that you have always talked about. Are there no other models that can be engineered to respond to some of these violences that have been created then, so that we have state that is friendly to its citizens, that can be accommodative to all in diversity? Because for me, the challenge is about managing our diversity. It is at the center of everything. Even if you go to beyond the Asians, look at the other ethnic communities. The Northerners, they said, let them suffer, it is their turn. You would hear those footnotes. This time they say, the Westerners, we shall see. Now, those are statements. So, how do we manage diversity in this country called Uganda? Do we need a national dialogue for a new process? The constitutions are all being dismantled. So, what is it? Professor, sir, let me stop here.
Indeed. Thank you so very much, Lyandro. You have taken us on very different planes. A lot of discussive terrain has been covered there. Thank you so much for the panel. Let me take the rare privilege as the moderator to open this up for question, comment, answer. I say question, not questions. Now, the panelists have given us all they had given us in very, very tolerable minutes. I will be extremely strict with the time. I will beg that we write down our question, if it is a question, or our comment. And we shall respect a half-minute rule to ask the question. I'm going to collect some 5 from the group. Let us have the microphone each side. We will entertain 3 with an allowance of 5, and then we shall eventually give our key lecturer concluding minutes to reflect back on both the panel and the liberty to choose whatever question they have. So, and then we shall eventually usher in our chief exhibitor, Dr. Nabulime, to come to the floor. So, question or comment? I'm going to, the 2 hands here which have been up here. I will start with Madam. Apology for not knowing the name. I will go straight to the gentleman there. Yes, Prof. I will pick the student up there, I guess, right? Yeah, there is a student right there. There is yet another student, and then I'll take the 4th hand, and I'll conclude here with the 3rd hand. Senior officers and the men are still in observatory mode. I've not seen any hands from the senior officers. Great. So let's start with our first one here. Madam, yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Professor Mamdani's lecture was very interesting. Somebody like me who was also a refugee and stateless in UK. What I want...
May I mind if you can stand? Maybe you could stand and project the voice.
Thank you. I was just saying that the lecture was very interesting and thought-provoking, and especially for somebody like me who also was a refugee in England when we became stateless. Some of us decided to come back. And what I can see here is the racial thread that runs through the expulsion and the return, and Asians being known as investors in some sectors. And of course, our immigration laws are quite biased. What collectively the eminent panel can suggest that we can take forward to bring more unity amongst the communities, and for all of us to be known as Ugandans rather than as Indians or Asians or ethnicity being defined by their tribes. Thank you.
Thank you for that success question. Yes, question number 2.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Mine is more of a personal question to Professor Mamdani. In March 1985, you argued that the calamities which were taking place in this country were social catastrophes. And as a result of that, the Obote government threw you out of this country. You were deported to Tanzania. Now, 2 questions. I'm very curious. Why were you deported to Tanzania? Why not India or UK? Did you have the Tanzanian citizenship? And secondly, what has been happening in this country with Karamoja and Bududa and all this? Do you have the same, would you reach the same conclusion that what actually is happening in this country today is not natural calamities, but rather social catastrophes? Thank you.
Thank you, Shimba. I have just one question per presenter. My first question goes to Professor Mahmood Mamdani. So, Prof, you talk about the existence of the Sidi community in India, but these were freed slaves. So, my question then is, how do we understand the current situation of the Sidi in India vis-a-vis the privileged Indians who are in Uganda? And then, from there, where should the decolonization start from? Then to Professor Tamale, if the Indians seek to keep intact their cultural preservations, yet the nature of the fluid tribes lies largely in the capacity to have an acculturation, say in Uganda, isn't this resistance by the Indians themselves to be part of the Ugandan community? And if it can be so, then what are the Indians protecting themselves from, and what are they envisioning?
Thank you so much, Professor Mamdani and the panel for this lecture. My name is Adventino Banjwa. I'm a PhD fellow at MISA. My question goes to Professor Lwanga Lunyiigo. Professor, I'm asking this question because of your choice for the word native, not citizen. And from the work of historians like you, Professor, we know that our history is a history of migrations. How would you reflect on the question, when does an immigrant become a native, if we are to stick with the use of a native, not a citizen? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Moses Molondo. I'm a journalist with The New Vision. And I'm also the president of Uganda Parliamentary Press Association. My question goes to all the panelists looking for a solution. Because Professor Mamdani talks about continued demarginalization of the Indians. But also as Ugandans, we've been having a lot of conflicts. And so many people think we are on a time bomb. Different groups of people that feel marginalized from power and sharing the national cake. There are concerns about our army, and I can see there are so many here, that it is dominated by Ugandans from Western Uganda, and other Ugandans think they are being dominated by those from Western Uganda. And many think that because of that, the country is on a time bomb. And as I finish, you remember that the Luwelo War, I come from Luwelo, many people have termed it as a war that was between the north and the south of Uganda, that it was a tribal war. And basically, actually, most of the wars that we have on the continent are ethnic wars. So what is the solution? This is the question to the panelists. What do you think is the solution? How can we build a Uganda where we can all feel we are fairly treated, the different groups, the different races, the different tribes? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now let me use my rare privilege to give a floor to Captain Bernard. We have Captain Bernard Tumwesigire, who is in our midst here. Please make your comment or question. It's fine to speak from there.
First of all, thank you, Professor Mamdani, and also thank you, Professor Sylvia Tamale, Professor Samwiri, and Honorable Komakech. Congratulations, Honorable Tamale. When I was a student here at the LLB, you were still the doctor. So I congratulate you, Professor Sylvia Tamale. Going back to my comment, Professor Tamale, I beg to submit. You recall in 2011, your husband, Dr. Oroka, wrote about me having been the ED, departed the Asian Property Custodian Board, and left the office unceremoniously. So I beg to inform you, this was as a result of writing a very good report called the Review Management Report of how Custodian Board can move to the highest level and harmonize the indifferences. So I ended up becoming a victim, but about a year ago, having done that wonderful job, I was again called by the Office of the President to work on harmonization of Asians and indigenous Ugandans. So I beg to submit the gray area and the fears of prediction are being worked on by the government of Uganda. So I'm coordinating an operation called Operation Harmony on expropriated properties in Uganda between Asians and sitting tenants. So your fear, it's my comment to inform you that your fear and prediction is being done by the government of the Republic of Uganda.
Thank you.
That was a comment. On part of Professor Mamdani, I beg to pose a serious question which also covers the generals who are here. Can Uganda, this is a question I beg to put it to you, can Uganda guarantee its sovereignty without the super powers, AG, USA, India, UK, which hosted Asians who left in Uganda in 1972? That is the question I beg to pose to you. Otherwise, the generals present here, you're welcome, and I'm happy to see you. At one time I presented my paper.
Thank you.
Hoping that you will attend to it. It is before General Sare. I beg to submit.
Thank you so very much. Very last one, the director of training at Chimaka. Please, get the honor of a minute. A minute, please.
It will be a minute. Thank you very much. Before I say anything, let me introduce in one way that these are not generals, but these are generals who are studying there for 1 year at National Defense College, but at the same time doing a master's of security strategy at Makerere University here. So there are students here, except for the commandant and then the senior staff who are teaching. So there are students here. They are in their capacity as others. Now, my question is very simple to my teacher, who taught me from 79, we were here. Masters, he supervised me, and we have been together up to now. Two things. One, the first one is after your book of the Myth of Population Control in 1972, you came with the second book on from citizen to citizen to refugee. You remember that book? I would like to know what has changed from then, that conception of citizenship at that time to the present, and why you think that things which were put there have shifted. Two, if you look at the situation in northern Uganda, vis-a-vis, for example, Israel, with the Palestinian question, you go to other places and you see Konyi versus, for example, the population and the Republic of Uganda. Would you consider that as the same as the Asian question? Would you lump them together, the Palestinian question, the Asian question, and you lump them, for example, with the Holy Spirit, like when a movement or other social movements you have seen in Uganda, vis-a-vis the Republic of Uganda? And if you are in power, how would you solve that, such situations, such a confrontation between the Holy Spirit movement or even Ford Sanko's movement in Sierra Leone and so on and so forth? If you are in power, in charge of political power, you might help us because you have been a professor of political science for so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me have the microphone back. Thank you so very much, audience, for honoring our strict rules. We are tempered, but we shall be winding up soon. There is one question from the online audience. I just want to pose it, and then we shall invite Professor Mamdani for final remarks. Take us back to the inequality. How do we address privilege among groups and address income inequality in this question of the Indian expulsion? Thanks. All right. Maybe let me just have Professor Tamale for a word, a question which was addressed to her, as the key lecturer recollects to come and give us his concluding remark. Professor Tamale, there was a question that was addressed to you. Will you want to say a word on the, I think intermarriages came as a theme?
Yeah, she asked about the type of the way I understood it, that doesn't the fact that Indian men use the excuse of culture, doesn't that reflect a type of resistance to integration? And again, as I said in my speech, I think just what we need to take out of our thinking, our minds, is that you can use women. You can use women's bodies as an instrument of integration. Women's bodies are not instruments for such things. And it's historically, this has been the case. Nationhood, that's why you hear people talking about motherland. You know, when nation building is linked to women's bodies, you know, and referring to countries as she, it's meant to psychologically, build nationhood and feel that, you know, you're part of this country. But it's wrong. And so that whole issue of using women's bodies as part of integration should be wiped out of our minds, out of the question of this issue. I mean, issues of integration are very, very important and very deep, very complex. It's not just Indians and Ugandans. You know, when I got married to a Japadola, that was an issue. And we are both black. You know, so integration is an issue that requires another panel, that requires a deeper and more complex discussion than this.
Thank you so much for that. A rainbow-like nation, someone said. Sometimes the rainbows, we're told, comes after a very serious storm, and the rainbow announces the end of the storm. We are here in the thick of the storm, and someone is saying we need a rainbow-like nation. Should we wait for the storm to get over, or we impose a rainbow in the middle of the storm? Do we become integrated by intermarriage? How far historically has it proven that those who intermarry eventually bring their part of themselves into the integration equation? We don't know. Prof, please, your final remarks. You may please stand.
Thank you very much. This has turned out to be a marathon. I know at Miser we have 3-hour seminars, but I thought at Makerere it was 1 hour, maximum 2 hours. Anyway, it's a privilege, and I'll make some comments on what my colleagues have said and a few comments on the questions. My major disagreement I'd say there are two important disagreements I have. One is that there is from my point of view, the way I heard it, there's a certain determinism in what my colleagues have had to say. I'll give some examples. Now, how do we write history? We're focusing on the 1972 expulsion. Because the expulsion happened, do we write as if the expulsion was inevitable? That's one way of writing it. That whatever happened was bound to happen because it happened. It's a tautology, circular reasoning. But the other way of writing it is to look at the balance of forces when it happened. Not just in a military sense, but to look at the different kinds of analysis at the time it happened, different points of views, and ask ourselves, were there other options? I mean, why do we study history? Do we study history to get a sense of possibilities, other options? Which is why I pointed to those amongst the pre-72 Asians who had a sense of other options, who had a critique of the Asians themselves, but they also had a critique of the power. Not that there were many. I'm not interested in what Professor Lunyiigo seems to be interested in, which is the search for good Indians. The Ismailis, he says, are the good Indians, which is astonishing. Because if the bad Indians for you are the Indians who were wealthy, then the wealthiest of the Indians included the Lohanas, the Patels, the Ismailis. Okay? I'm not interested in the good Indians. I'm interested in whether there was a different point of view amongst Indians. One of the most interesting was Rajat Nyogi, the editor of Transition, who gets together with Ali Mazrui he gets together with the lawyer with whom he's jailed, and he has a very different notion of what kind of future we could have. For that Obote strips him of his citizenship, throws him in jail, puts him in isolation until he literally loses his mind. Before that, he begins a journal which attracts the cream of the African intelligentsia throughout Africa. The cream of the African American intelligentsia, from Langston Hughes to James Baldwin. But once he's put in jail, he loses his mind. He's released by Amin when Obote is overthrown. He wants to become a Muslim and take on the name Amin. And he asks Ali Mazrui to be a witness. And Mazrui says no. Mazrui says, I'm a Muslim, and from my point of view, conversion requires conviction. You cannot have conversion out of coercion. To make this story short, Rajat Nyogi goes to the US with his American wife, and he dies in San Francisco. He becomes just a homeless person. And he dies in People's Park. He's found in the early morning, dead on the bench. We brought Rajat Nyogi's daughter to Mysore for a symposium on transition, and she brought the ashes of her father. We scattered those ashes. Komshenga, who was the editor of Vision at the time, promised to put up a plaque. He's a young man, so he still has a lot of time to fulfill that promise. I want to give you a second example of determinism. The relationship between economics and politics. And the claim that Marx believed that economics determined politics. Economics was the base and politics the superstructure. Even Marx did not hold on to that. Most Marxists said, no, this kind of determinism will not work. If we are revolutionaries and we are faced by economic power which is overwhelming, instead of surrendering to it by saying economics determines politics, we must think of ways of confronting it politically. I want us to think of Idi Amin and Yoweri Museveni, two political personalities in Uganda who in some ways are remarkably similar. Amin comes to power. Both Amin and Museveni come to power and realize within a year that they don't have the resources to do what it is they want to do. What to do now? Question both of them face. Amin comes to power, support of Britain and Israel. Amin is confronted by the possibility of being overthrown by Obote's soldiers supported by Tanzania. He goes to Israel and Britain, and he wants arms. And they say, forget it. He realizes that he, from their point of view, they've used him and they have no interest in him anymore. I mean, he turns the tables around. Amin now turns to Gaddafi, through Gaddafi to Numeri, says, okay, you want to settle the problem in South Sudan? I will help you settle it because I have the links with Anyanya. First, throw out the Israeli advisor to the Anyanya. Harris throws him out. The point is, Amin confronts, Amin expels first the Israelis, then the Indians, then the British, without anybody being able to get back to him. Ask yourself, what economic power did he have? What was the nature of his politics? I mean, you say fail. Everybody fails eventually. Okay. Maybe you can say death is failure. But Amin goes down fighting. Museveni comes into power and realizes in the very first year he has hardly any money in the treasury. How is he going to survive? He decides on an opposite strategy. He believes economics determines politics. Museveni surrenders to the IMF, to the Americans. It works. They give him a carte blanche, blank check. He is able to rule with impunity. We're still in the middle of the story, so I can't end it. But there's a relationship between economics and politics. The question, which is decisive, to me makes no sense. Under what conditions? I come to my questions. So there was one question on Tanzania. Why did I go to Tanzania? Why not India? Why should I have gone to India? Tell me. Why should I have gone to India? My father was born in Dar es Salaam. My mother was born in Kigoma. I went to madrasa in Dar es Salaam. Primary 1, 2, 3 in Dar es Salaam before coming to Kampala, to Masaka actually, Nyendo, to be specific. Why should I have gone to India? I mean, what for? Well, it was not even a choice. Another question, let me just. And I went to Dar es Salaam, and the Attorney General did say to me, karibu nyumbani. I said, and he said, nataka passport yetu? Mimi nataka passport yangu ya Uganda. That was our discussion. And he said, you're welcome to stay as long as you want to stay. He knew my parents were both born in Tanzania. Let me just. The situation of Idi, I think cities, was that the question? In India, Now that question is slightly outside the framework of this, but I was simply trying to say that the CDs, who were different kinds of people through a long history, who were sailors initially in the dhows in Indian Ocean trade, who were pearl divers all along the Arabian Sea. These were mostly East Africans, from the Horn right up to Mozambique, who were enslaved in the later period, but most important, they were soldiers. They have been known, in the literature they are called slave soldiers. I have huge doubts about the adjective slave. They were captives, but they were captives who became generals. A famous Ethiopian general in central India. Anyway, I won't go into these details, but it's a story we have to look at separately. One, a new vision. Are you there? You're there. So, what's the solution? You know, every time we get the first year students at MISA, this is the question they ask. What is the solution? I say to them, get this question out of your head. Ask yourself, what is the problem? That's the real question. If you understand the problem, you are 90% of the way to finding a solution. How you formulate the problem will give you the solution. What's the problem? This is not the place to talk about. Murindo, you've asked the same question in a different way. How would I solve these questions if I were in power? Fortunately for all of us, I'm not in power. Okay? It's dangerous business to put professors in power because they think. You know, when we think freely. We don't accept any constraints. The first thing, if you're in power, is to come to grips with constraints. Put me in power and then I'll answer the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are not about to put you in power, we are going to put you in conversation with power. Thank you so very much, dear panelists, and for your patience. I'm sure the bladders are full, the sugar levels are down for many, and so should we bring this to an end. We are going to have a very quick unraveling of a very beautiful piece of fine art. And with that, we shall allow Dr. Lydia Mary Nahulini to join the panel, give us a comment about that exhibition, and then we shall call the co-director of the Keynote project, Dr. Noel. You may please join the high pedestal. It's a very privilege to have Dr. Nahulini, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Fine Arts and Industrial Fine Arts at the Makerere University. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. And I think I'm here because of the public networking. 2 weeks ago, I met Professor Mamdani, and I told someone who had a lunch with his great wife, Myra, And then that was the day I told you, I've done a sculpture, a model for Leicester on the 50th anniversary expulsion. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. Can you bring it to my lecture? It's so important. And then, the Makerere said, we didn't have to fire those pieces, because these pieces, as you see them, they are not fired. So I had to struggle to fire them. And when I gave them to my colleague, he just fired two of them, half of them. And then the other half, I told him, we have to fire these pieces. I have to have this presentation. And yesterday by 10 o'clock, that's when I was able to get the second part of it. And we lost a colleague of ours, and I was in Mumbai, and then today, this morning, I said, go, you have to be with me, and I have to present this sculpture when they are fired. This, 3 months ago, the city of Leicester in the UK set out a call to put up a model for remembrance of this anniversary. And I said to myself, I think I can. And I talked to my colleague, he said, yes, you can. And I got the sculptures, and to my surprise, I was shortlisted, and I was also paid for money. But though I didn't win, but I felt so proud that I also joined the international level, and I was also on the team. And this, for me, how I was interpreting the expulsion was that these people had their families, and this was the first, the man and his wife, they're all in the soccer mood. And then we are taking all the luggages, the suitcases. But when I'm working, usually I consult my colleagues or my students. One of them is Sylvia, who is doing this PhD in Durham. And then he said, Madam, what is most important was at that time was the no problem bag. This bag here. That much as some may not have had their possessions, but they had that bag which had some few money and maybe their papers which are the most important in their lives. I said, well, yes. So I would use also symbols because you cannot relate all the stories. The palm, because they moved from Uganda where you see the map, and then the back has the symbol of the palm. These Asians have really made it up in the UK. They have made businesses, they have prospered. And one of the reasons I think of prosperity, as family, they work together, at the same time, family working together. So they have their family, and this, when I was making, I left out the children, and the other is the children. So all are put them together down there. So have the children, the family, the money, and the education is very important, right? The Asians are doing well because they are studying. And I'm happy to hear these generals here. I'm happy they also come to do their studies. But Uganda is a wonderful country. I've studied abroad. Somebody paid my PhD. And I was there. One time I felt I could become a refugee. Can we protect this country so that we love one another and we don't become refugees? And at the same time, let us protect our land. Let us protect our environment. We should plant trees. Please, I think we should include planting trees in these studies because it is relevant. We don't have heart of believe that if the land is coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabulime. As the voter marches to the floor, I want to remind you that the discussion should continue online. It is fully open. It has been live streamed. And please drop a comment for those who may be having lingering comments. Drop a comment to the Refugee Law Project, info@refugeelawproject.org, and they will pick it up. We are also interested as the academia to follow up this conversation and drop a question. I'm sure the panelists and the key lecturers will want this conversation even by other means after here. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for an excellent moderation. Thank you for this session. On behalf of the Refugee Law Project and the School of Law, Makerere University and Amani Institute, we thank you all for coming for this event. For the closing remarks, I'm just saying thank yous. I want to specify agreeing to come here to be our guest speaker. And also to all the panelists, Professor Sylvia Tamale, Professor Samwiri Lwanga Lunyiigo, and Honorable Lyandro Komakech. I'd like to also say a special thank you to Bani Afeko. He doesn't want to really like the limelight, but thank you so much for helping us to organize this event. I'd also like to recognize the contribution of the Refugee Law Project staff members here who work tirelessly. I know all of us got a short notice, but thank you for coming. And I would also want to thank Gilbert Luwagira. He likes also to remain in the background, but has also helped us a lot today. So I want to end by saying thank you so much. We have light refreshments and snacks, so don't leave without taking something. So at this point, I would like to close this event, and thank you so much for coming today.